In this session, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the vagaries of finance and taxes on your electronic commerce site. I really just want to touch on some of the key points that might catch you by surprise. This is not a comprehensive talk about accounting or other finances, but it's really more a discussion of some of the things that maybe people aren't aware of or things that might catch you as you're sort of building out your site. So let's start out with the fun one, which is sales tax. So most of these systems, when you go in there, you can set your sales tax. Some of them will actually automatically calculate sales tax. Uh, they calculate the tax based on either your store address or the shipping address of the customer. And so it's really important to keep that in mind because you might have customers who are coming in, ordering online, and coming to do a pickup, and they might be from another address. And you need to make sure if they're coming to your store and picking it up that they're paying your local sales tax rate. You can't have them paying their own rate. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. That'll make a whole lot more sense. Um, you also want to make sure that you're setting the right amounts on each of your products. In a lot of jurisdictions, they have a different scale of pricing on sales tax depending on what it is you're selling. So they might have a hospitality tax or a meals tax that comes in in addition to the state taxes. And that might not apply to everything that you're selling. So an example would be if you're a coffee shop and you're selling coffee and pastry, you might have to pay the meals tax on that coffee and pastry. But if you're selling mugs or you're selling bags or T-shirts, all of that might be considered merchandise, and that meals tax doesn't apply to it. And ideally, what you want to do in your system is set it up so you can set different tax classes to each of the items in the system, and that way you're not overcharging and overpaying sales tax on products that don't require that full set of taxes. So let's talk about the concept of sales tax nexus. This has the most bearing on you if you're shipping product or doing delivery that goes outside of your regular sales tax area, and it's an important concept to keep in mind. For a long time, sales tax nexus online meant that you had a physical presence in a location, in a state. Uh, so that would mean if you had a store, if you had an office, if you had a warehouse, if you had a physical presence in the state, you were considered to have sales tax nexus. And what does that mean? That means you've got to collect and pay sales tax to that locality yourself. You can't rely on the customer to send that tax in. And what happened back in the day is if you had tax nexus somewhere, you'd pay sales tax just for sales in that area, and everyone else in every other area was required to pay generally what's called a use tax to their state or locality to cover things they bought outside of that state or locality. Well, the rules have changed pretty significantly, and now definitely you have to collect from a nexus of anywhere you have a location, but there's also now the concept of what's called economic nexus. And so economic nexus means that you are selling a certain amount of product in that locality, and thus you have adopted economic nexus in that locality. The crazy thing about it is each state can set its own laws about where outside companies are allowed to not pay or collect the sales tax and what numbers they do need to do it. Right now, the going rate is about $100,000 of sales in each of the states, but each state sort of has its own rules. So this means, for example, if you're on a border town and you've got a lot of interest from people in your next door state and you think you're selling a lot of product right over the state line, you very likely have economic nexus there, and you should be collecting sales tax for that locality and remitting that to them. The crazy and tricky thing about this is a lot of states have a lot of different local tax levels, and you're going to have to actually work with a service or download files to reflect what their rates are in all these different areas. An example, North Carolina, for instance, has a lot of different rates in each locality, and so it's not as simple as saying your sales tax is 5.3%. You have to get it for each of the localities. If you're in Charlotte or you're in another city, you might be paying a different rate than somewhere else. And other states are very much the same way. So it's really important to understand the concept of sales tax nexus, because that's where you could get caught legally by states coming after you trying to get sales tax collected. Let's change gears from taxes. I will show you, this is a little report of, this is WooCommerce, so just an example of WooCommerce. It does generate a report of how much tax you've collected, and if you had multiple tax rates, it would show you one line for each locality that you have in the system, and it actually allows you to add localities down to the city and zip code level. So you can show zip code rates, you can show city rates, and all that gets calculated based again on either the location of your store or the location of your customer's shipping address. And it's not the billing address, it's the shipping address. So just keep that in mind as you're doing configuration of your site. Another gotcha when you're using these systems, and we sort of mentioned this before in the overview, the way that funds get settled in these systems is sort of all over the map. Some of them transfer funds immediately, some of them there's a lag. And what happens on a few systems that we've seen, for example, is if somebody buys something and the transaction hasn't fully settled and they decide they want a refund, when you go to process the refund, you might not be able to process their refund until the funds have settled. And so if you're ever in your system and you're trying to generate a refund for somebody and it's not sending them the refund, give it a little bit of time for your transactions to settle. And at that point, you might be able to push that refund through when you weren't able to do it before. We've definitely seen that happen a few times. The other thing to bear in mind, of course, is that these funds generally, if they're sitting in a holding account like they do with Stripe or PayPal, that there is a sweep that goes on and moves that money from that account to your main bank account. And some of that you have to configure on your own. So just keep that in mind when you're talking about cash flow and knowing where the funds are. They might be sitting in an account that hasn't swept yet, and you want to make sure you know where your funds are and when they're going to move. Now, on these systems, as we've talked about before, reporting actually happens in two different places. It happens on your e-commerce platform. It also happens on your payment system platform. And the payment system is much more geared toward X person gave you X number of dollars using X card. And the e-commerce platform's reporting is much more geared around you sold 30 units of this particular product. So I'll give you an example. This is actually, I've grayed out the actual information, but this is a Stripe backend that shows you transactions that came in from Stripe over a certain period of time. And as you see, each of these lines has customer information, has a description information, a price of the product, and then a date. But if you went into each of these transactions and tried to get deeper level detail on them, it wouldn't give you enough to ship product. It would tell you kind of what they bought, but it wouldn't give you enough information to really do a product ship. Now this is a WooCommerce report, and this is actually showing you a last 7 days report of sales. And what it does is it actually shows you your gross sales, and then it shows you a net sales. And what they're netting out is taxes and shipping costs. So you can see what your cost was and how much you charge for shipping, how many orders it was. And you'll see that there are lots of different tabs on here that you can go in and get additional reports. Most e-commerce systems have a similar kind of reporting. So this is the WooCommerce report on a single product. So you can actually go and say, well, how many of this product did I sell and how many did I sell on each day? Let's change gears from reporting, and I want to talk about another sort of weird financial thing, and this is recurring payments. So let's say that you wanted to have a subscription box and you are sending the soap of the month out to a set of subscribers. In order to do that, you need to set up what's called recurring payments, and certain payment processors do this. The important thing to know about recurring payments is that the credit card data is generally not stored on your website. It's stored at your payment processor in a sort of electronic lockbox. And it uses these things called tokens to identify to your site with your site. So your site knows that the payment information is there, and so it communicates in a secure way to say, hey, we've got somebody with a recurring payment. We need to charge their card now. Most of these setups can be done with automatic renewal, which I highly recommend. If you get somebody who's given you your credit card information and you stored that and you can renew them automatically, that's a great way to retain customers. Some of the systems also have manual renewals, and the way manual renewal works is when the subscription is getting ready to expire, it just sends a message out and says, hey, it's time to renew this. and they have to go in and put their card information back in the system and rerun it. Automatic is better than manual if you can make customers do that. Now, one thing that we're seeing more of these days is the level of credit card fraud and theft has really gone way up. And so we're seeing way more people who have credit cards that change before their regular expiration date. So most of these credit card processors actually will, if a credit card changes over the course of doing business, let's say it gets a new expiration date, they do a pretty good job of keeping that in their system and updating your token so you don't have to do anything. But ultimately, you're going to end up in a situation where you've got customers whose cards have expired or been stolen, they've been issued new cards, and their renewal doesn't work anymore. You really have to keep track of your subscribers if you're doing some sort of subscription box, whether that's a subscription box or a magazine or anything else, a membership, anything else they're subscribing to. You really need to ride herd on these renewals, and especially if you're on an automatic renewal, you want to be keeping an eye on your renewals and saying, hey, for some reason this person's gotten kicked over in the manual renewal, and that means their card is probably bad, and we need to go reach out to them, even if it's a phone call or an email, and saying, hey, we need new card information from you in order to be able to keep your subscription going. We've found that a little bit of manual work does a lot to preserve revenue around subscriptions. I'm going to show you, this is just, again, a sort of blanked out report from Stripe. So this is an actual customer report, and you'll see that it's storing card data. Now, I cannot go into Stripe and get this full credit card number. All I can see is the final four. They've saved the rest of it. But there is a token in there that I can go and connect to my website, so my website knows that it can go and get a payment from these guys. So those are just a few random financial considerations that you should have when you're doing e-commerce. I'm sure there are other things that will arise, and as we think of them or hear about them, we'll try to do some additional presentations about the financial things to think about and the gotchas that you might run into when you're running your e-commerce site.